very much for coming to the session. You're finished. Okay. At the end of a very long day. My title really, in terms of around classroom pedagogy, is from the perspective of teachers. And as a teacher trainer, I come across teachers all the time who feel that what they're doing is not good enough, it's not techy enough, it's not interesting enough, can't be shared, you name it, anything to do with negativity, it's there. So I thought, well, maybe what we need to start doing in the area of teacher training is maybe to revisit that and to maybe evaluate what they are doing to see the potential in it. Just as the introduction mentioned, I work on the EA programme at the University of the Arts in Central London, primarily on the in-sessional and pre-sessional, and I'm particularly interested in the intersection between art and science. How then we can embed language into this, and then how we can introduce technology in a very creative way. I was very heartened to hear Russell talking this morning, not about technology, but in terms of how we need to start using it. My talk today is not primarily going to look at the tools, but really the planning process. In order to use technology effectively in the class, it has to be planned very well. It has to be planned strategically, and it takes time. And this is something I think that teachers feel a bit challenged by. If they get a tool, they want to start using it now, which might be great in terms of developing your skill set, but in order to actually use it to create something, it does take time. So I'm going to go through a couple of things. I work on a lot of projects, and I've decided to focus on two. And to look at what I learned from them and how they are feeding into teacher training in the area of language and technology. The first was a project that I was involved with earlier on this year for the UNESCO Conference on Mobile Education, looking at women and technology. And I decided that, well, let's do something looking at Ireland, given the fact that we have a huge or a very high density of tech companies here. Sure, there must be something in terms of that trickle-down effect that's impacting Irish society, and they were all very, very tech-savvy. So I thought maybe I'd do something around that. And the second is just teacher training sessions I ran for Cambridge English, and just the feedback that I had from teachers and the questions that they were asking me around technology. I thought, maybe there's something that we could do to address that. And I'm going to look at the area of collaboration and really what that means. This is, I suppose, one of the outputs that I produced for UNESCO. I spent about 6 weeks visiting schools, companies, people's homes around Ireland, interviewing women and girls about their experiences of mobile education. And what's really interesting in the education space is that everyone talks about, we should be creating. But actually research shows us that very few people, men or women, know actually what their phones are for, bar making a phone call, sending a text, using Facebook, WhatsApp, and a few other communication tools. Apart from that, we're not really aware of what can be done. And I thought this would be really interesting to start to look at the base of community level, to see what if you're asking students to go out into the community, who are they actually interacting with? And if we as a society don't know what technology is capable of doing, how can we expect teachers to know? And how can we expect that to be brought into the classroom? It was really, really interesting presenting alongside teachers who come from resource-limited contexts, and what they were doing absolutely phenomenal with no money, no resources, and no tech ecosystem. And it was something then that I fed back into the tech companies and saying, look, we have all of this here on this tiny island, and we should be able to try and get it together. One of the things that I started to use from the conference was what I learned from teachers and teacher trainers in Southern Africa. And I was involved in this workshop, and we were getting group of threes. And I turned to this woman next to me and I said, okay, so where are you from? And she just happened to be the Minister of Education in Zambia. I said, you don't say. And I said, so what's your biggest problem? And she said, well, we can't get teachers to use technology. I said, no way. And I thought, God, it's just everywhere. Whether you have resources or whether you don't, it's still an issue. What was really interesting there was they were using WhatsApp as a teacher training tool and be using it to target teachers in resource-limited contexts. And I thought, I've never used WhatsApp for teaching. I thought, oh, why not? So what's also interesting there is that unless you live in an urban area and have access to some kind of a smartphone and have access to data, then of course WhatsApp is for you. But what if you don't? And it was really interesting learning more about how they're trying to commercialise that, enter into commercial agreements with operators such as ELT to get them to support education. But when I came back, I said, well, I'm going to try and do something using WhatsApp for teacher training. And I decided on this activity just as a starting point. This was in preparation for the pre-sessional course that ran from June to August of this year. So I started planning about April. And as part of the assessment, the students have to create a London project. It could be anything, but they must produce an artwork, sometimes with a digital component, that must reflect London. So I was in a bookshop and I just saw this and thought, oh my God, this would be fantastic. Maybe I could start here. And so I just jotted down some ideas in terms of how maybe I could use it, again from a language perspective. And I just thought, this is really, really boring. And then I thought, what if I ask other people how they would use it? So I'd have to take 30 seconds, if you could just maybe shout out some ideas to me in terms of how you would use that book. If you saw the front cover, what would you use it for? Anything? Yeah.
I was thinking into one of the tools so for example, you could let the students search for the different pictures and maybe like present something or tell us like what is it, where it's found, why is it like an attraction or something?
Yeah, brilliant, yeah. Anybody else? Please.
What era of art does this design come from? That's the question I would ask.
Sorry.
It's just like graphic images,
Yes.
get the students to go and do Google search and see if they can find similar kinds of style.
Yeah, no. And it also helps because the illustrator works at CSM, which is one of the colleges at UAL. So I thought it might be easy then in terms of their own research process to learn more about an artist in residence. Anyways, what I did was I asked my colleagues and they gave me lots of suggestions and I thought, oh my God, it's still so boring. Because we're all saying the same thing. It may be slightly different, but because we're all coming from it from a language perspective, we're all talking roughly the same thing. So what I did then was I started to speak to others. So I went to design lecturers, fashion lecturers, language as I said. Then I went into secondary school and I gave each of them, using WhatsApp, 30 seconds to just look at the front cover and decide, would you use it? Because maybe they wouldn't. And they all said yes. And I said, well, how would you use it? So then they all started coming back with ideas of how they would use it from their context. So this allowed me, for example, in the design context, I had feedback from one of the tailors from the Royal Opera House, and I had feedback from a designer from Channel 4. So again, their perspective was completely different to mine, and that allowed me, I feel, to deliver, I suppose, a much more engaging session in terms of, as opposed to what I would have done normally. And one of the requirements that we have at UAL is that you can do anything you want, but that you must model failure for the students. So we have free rein, really, which is great. So effectively then what I did was, in feedback when I delivered this lesson, they had to use this as a model in terms of how they're going to collaborate with other people outside of their subject area, to develop their ideas, develop their concept, look at projects or ideas for potential projects, and then using WhatsApp as a tool. So far it has been very, very successful, and I've used it then to help teachers to replicate that with their students. Bearing in mind some of them are undergrad and postgrad students. They all have a mobile device and they all have data plans, so it works from that perspective. After meeting the teachers in Zambia, I thought, well, there's only one way to find this out in terms of, is something like this going to work? How would it work in a resource-limited context in terms of looking at, in this case it was science literacy, but how can we bring all of the learning and the value that's in contexts like this into our own classroom environment? So I thought the only way to do that is to go over there and find out. So I joined a project during the summer after the pre-sessional, and I went to Uganda to train teachers in using solar-powered mobile devices. There were solar-powered iPads. So we looked at the area of science literacy that involved a 2-day course to make teachers more aware of the language of science, then introduced iPads into the classroom, and then we brought the solar panels in and off we went. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. The teaching itself was amazing, but the ecosystem around the teacher was shambolic. Which, you know, working in classrooms with 100+ students, not getting paid, really limited resources, no electricity, decisions being made left, right, and centre. So in terms of creating a strategy and having a strategy for teacher training was very, very challenging. But what we were able to do is to, first of all, identify how mobile technology could be used in this context, potential projects that could be developed in partnership with teachers and teacher training colleges, and then how we can bring that into our own context and then collaborate with students and teachers there, so that we obviously develop professionally. So there's a programme that's been planned at the moment for these teachers once they have reached a certain level of proficiency using technology. I'll give you one example. I thought maybe just using the camera would be quite straightforward. And there was one man in the class, and he just wouldn't go out and take images that related to science. And I thought, that's really strange. I thought, anyone ever take a photograph? And they all have Nokia phones. None of them had smartphones. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm sure he must be used to doing that. And it was only maybe 2.5 hours into the activity, and I realised that his phone didn't have a camera. And I just thought I should have checked that first of all, but I didn't. Which obviously made sense then in terms of justifying his reluctance to get involved, because he didn't have outside experience of using a camera and the value of that. So in terms of, I suppose, looking at it in terms of carrying out a more thorough needs analysis, because I had very high expectations of what could be done. But we're looking to start a collaborative project with teachers in Zambia in February of 2016, and bringing that together with our own students. In terms of looking at feedback from teachers in the area of creativity in English language teaching, this is, I suppose, it's an overall summary of the types of feedback that comes back again and again and again. Okay, so they're not allowed to use devices in class, they can't manage them, the head teachers are not convinced, parents have to pay for devices, and then the limited role the English language teachers often have in schools, and therefore don't feel very confident in making any kind of assertion and navigating mobile technology. So I thought, well, how can we have a project that could maybe place the English language teacher at the epicentre of that process, and bring the other, his or her colleagues on board. So I was thinking about how to do this, and I came across this book, actually in King's Cross, and I read the inside of it, and I'd like you to read it now, please. Okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I read that and I thought, you need to have a heart of stone not to be moved by it. So I just closed the front cover and I said, I'm going to do this. And I thought, well, it has to take place in France, somewhere in France. So I know a couple of French teachers in Paris, and one is French-Algerian, and I got in touch with her and I said, this is what we're going to do. And she loved it. And I thought, well, now how can we bring your colleagues on board to look at a whole school project, placing English language teaching at the epicentre, and then once that's done, identifying a technology objective that you can all work towards. So we had 6 meetings that started in April of this year, and in her own time she went and convinced her colleagues from different subject areas, this is a secondary school, to get involved. So at the moment this represents who is currently working on the project, and the scheme of work for this term has been laying the foundations for World War I. So what I did then was I just developed a sketchbook of initial ideas that possibly could lend themselves to the project. One idea I took from this book called The Information Capital. It's 100 maps and graphics looking at the city from an alternative perspective. If you're interested in maps, it's a must-buy. And one of the ideas was, the map here was looking at the bombings in East London, and I was particularly attracted to the aesthetics of the image and looking at the colour contrast. The one on the right was about looking at if these streets could talk, what would they say? And I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting to try and recreate this experience with these students to go navigate the way around an area of Paris, developing a map and using augmented reality to share the experience of the soldier and his his American lover. So we looked at other things in terms of looking at fashion during World War I. So one of the activities that the English language students are going to do is get dressed up and go for a walk on a date in Paris and make a video about it and then bring that into the final outcome. Their initial objective was to learn how to use a QR code. And what was interesting there as well, they felt very embarrassed by only wanting to learn how to use a QR code because they had never used them before. And again, the point was that when you see all the work that's going to have to go into this to actually reach this stage, it isn't about just actually creating a code and maybe creating an audio file, but if you really plan it successfully, it can be a very successful whole school project. So now what we're looking at, once they kind of came out of the idea, and now we're looking at augmented reality, and the theme will be if these streets could talk, what would they say? And part of the research then for the students to conduct on this area was to look at other people who've embedded audio into their work. One is a corp photographer, Damien Drohan. He does amazing work on interviewing World War II veterans, really, really interesting. And collaborating or embedding both visual and audio. Another one that I looked at for the school was, this is a project in London called Talking Statues, and the idea here is that when you look at all the statues that we have in our community and we walk past them every day, I'm sure we have no idea what they are. There's guys down there with their hands in the air who don't care. So the project was about, well, how can we make these statues come to life? So basically then what they did was they built in some audio, so you see the little plaque here on the side. You hold up your phone, and in this case, your phone rings and Sherlock Holmes calls you and tells you something about his life. It speaks for 2 minutes. So there's a number of these around London and increasingly around London. I thought that's a really, really interesting idea to be able to use if you want to get students to go out in some shape or form and explore the local environment. So the history teacher is obviously going to prepare them from an historical perspective. The geography teacher is going to look at the physical landscape of the trenches and the physical landscape of Paris during the war. The science teacher is going to look, part of the project is also looking at science literacy, and I developed an app to help with the language of photosynthesis, and the science teacher is going to use the poppy as inspiration and look at the process of photosynthesis in the context of the poppy flower. The librarian is going to help the students to research all of this. The art teacher is going to recreate the front cover of the book, and the music teacher is going to work with them to write a piece of music for the project. So again, this will be an interactive map which will have some level of augmented reality built into it, and it hopefully will be starting in 2 weeks' time and will be ready in March 2016. So then just moving forward, what we're doing now is planning for projects for 2016, and depending on my time, I'll just fly through, I think about 5 minutes. Is that okay if I continue?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's just to throw out some ideas that we're looking at and probably will use. This one I just love. It's from the book, The Little Black Jacket, by Karl Lagerfeld from Chanel. And I just like this idea of having one item that everybody has or shares, and how they use it or adapt it to reflect their own personality. And I thought this would be a very interesting way for an induction for new students coming into school, and even get them to use their mobile phone, or give them all a hat and they'll all wear a hat a different way, and maybe using AR to create a video or an audio where they can all kind of engage in it. For those of you who like cooking, I'm always really interested when you look at cookery books, and you might get a whole cookery book on chicken, or a whole cookery book on baking. And what we have is the same ingredient time and time again. But yet, we all have these bank of lessons that we use once or twice and think, oh, I've got to do something else. But what if I could give you my lessons and I took yours? How would I adapt them? How would I use them? And it's just, I think, when you look at areas outside of education, they do it all the time. And I just, well, I know my own practice, I tend to want to keep doing things, new things all the time, which may not be an effective use of my time. So this is something that I'm looking at. I've identified a school in Paris who's going to do this, but I just don't know yet. I was, this is outstanding. I just happened to be walking down Bond Street, just for maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I came across this shop. Now, she's a very famous designer. I don't really know her very well, but I work at Only Called to Fashion, and some of my colleagues do. So I was aware of her, but don't know much about her. And I just saw this shop. I thought, what is it? I saw all those books. I said, hallelujah. So I just thought, let me go in. And then I saw a book of Edith Piaf. I said, oh, how am I going to get my hands on this? I said, is it a library? What is it? But no, it is actually her boutique. And she opened one on the Left Bank in Paris. She is also an author and a writer, and has been very upset by the diminishing number of bookshops on the Left Bank. So she decided, given the fact that her shop is taking up very expensive retail space, she thought, why not combine the two and use her boutique to compensate for the fact that, in this case, Parisians, or in this case, Londoners, don't have access, as much access to bookshops and books, so she has combined the two. So as I was in there looking at these books, I don't know, I was there for maybe half an hour, and someone came over to me and said, oh, so madame, what do you think of the collection? And I thought she meant the book collection. I said, oh, man, that's fabulous, that's fabulous. But anyhow, I was next to a bag worth 20 grand. I said, oh, you mean that? So isn't that fantastic? So I don't know yet how it's going to work, but I just think there's something in it. I saw, 2 years ago, I saw a report on Channel 4 News about how they were, how they visually represented the destruction of Aleppo in Syria. I thought the graphic was so, so powerful. And I thought we could write a piece of code in terms of how maybe we could represent the disappearance or the gradual disappearance of bookshops. But that's how I'm thinking it might be used, but I don't know yet, and I haven't spoken to the school yet, but anyhow. This is something I'm really interested in, is getting people to look up. So when you think about how we navigate our environment, it's always nearly at an eye level. So we go around, we look at the shops. Over here, you might, I see Starbucks over there, you might go up to the sign, the views, but you will never generally go much higher than that. And I thought, well, no, if we could just train students to look up and observe what is happening above them at above eye level, it can bring in a completely different experience. And then I thought, that would be interesting, but what if we could find a way to look down? And what type of experience would that give us? So this last Sunday, I went to the Walkie-Talkie building in central London, and it's the Sky Garden. It opened earlier on this year. It's on the 35th floor. It's an amazing view of London. I thought, well, it'd be really, really interesting to kind of have this type of perspective. So what language could be exploited from that? And in a workshop this morning, I just saw those buildings over there. It's not very good. But isn't the architecture so beautiful? Isn't it? And it wasn't. When I was actually teaching in IH a couple of years ago, there was a German student who came over, and she said, I said, are you enjoying Dublin? She said, oh, it's so fantastic. And she said, your architecture is amazing. I felt like saying, what architecture? But when you look at that, I know, yes. But when you look at that, it's very, very nice. This, when we went to the Sky Garden, what I did was I brought a green engineer with me, this guy here on the left, a guy in IT security, and a graphic designer. So their job is to look at what I'm looking at and tell me what they see, and together to create something. So it'll be a couple of months while we're developing. That's really the objective. And finally then, this was a project that I seen earlier on this year. It was launched by the GLA, the Greater London Authority, and it's looking at a London curriculum. We're getting teachers to bring their students out and use the city as the classroom. And then I saw the materials and I was very, very disappointed, and I thought there must be a better way of doing this. So there's one idea that I'm collaborating with a couple of postgraduate students, looking at London as a learning canvas, and to see, well, what can we create for language teaching based on that. This will all feed into a concept website that will be ready in January of 2016, so not long. So looking at English language teaching, creativity, technology, and then providing models for teachers that you may like to follow and then be able to adapt for yourself effectively. So I'm really finished. So if you're interested in anything I've said or in any area of collaboration or teacher training, just get in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.